I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today. I don't know how you have the time to do what you do, but you were like a miracle worker, really.
Sheer will and apparently not enough sleep.
Yeah.
I swear I got more sleep in college.
Wow. Nice.
Yeah. I mean, at some point, there's only so much you can practice. Like, there's a physical limit there. But now, because I work full-time outside of music, and then I come home and practice and do all of these other things, it can get a little... suddenly it's midnight, and I'm like, oh, I still have 10 things to do. Okay.
Yes, exactly. I guess working outside of music would almost make the music making part a little bit fresh.
It's not my end game. I don't want to do it forever. Like, I'm a professional musician and that's what I want to make most of my money on. Yeah. But it is really nice right now because it really does make the music more special. It's also like currently it's really helpful because I work in healthcare. So my job security is very secure, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Like it's been really, when I see all my friends really struggling to get a paycheck and make sure, especially when they were freelancing and like cobbling together performance gigs.
Oh yeah.
It's nice to at least know that I can get through this period. That being said, there's a lot to be said about like working in the field that you choose and not having a job that's completely unrelated to your degree. Right. But I mean, at some point you have to make a decision. And for now, we get the pharmacy life and the music life separate.
Yeah. That's neat. So where did you come up with the 100 Days of Composers idea?
So it's based on two of my other projects, the two longest ones, obviously. So 365 Days of Flute is my first one. That one was September 2016 to September 2017. It was exactly what it sounds like. It was a piece a day for a year, mostly standard rep because at that point, I was not comfortable with as many composer submissions or works by living composers. But there were 138, so I guess it was a third living composers, and some of the people that I did in the standard rep are still alive, so they count too.
Yeah.
But it was 138 pieces that were submitted by composers that like chose to be in the project. And then in 2018, I did 52 Weeks of Flute, which was kind of a combination of like my long-term process projects and a workshop model based on Splice Institute, which is a all electroacoustic summer music festival in Michigan. And they kind of run this really wonderful model of a week-long collaboration. Obviously, the pieces are written beforehand, but you have a week of like checking in and working with people and really workshopping the pieces that are culminating in a Saturday performance. And so I completely ripped off that model and did that once a week for the entirety of 2018, including the week of Splice Institute.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, I always have to say that I did not come up with that collaboration model in any way. That was definitely theirs. But yeah, so I had been done those, and I've been trying to work on another one, and my health has not managed to allow that. So most of 2019, I was just trying to get back into full shape and really like get my life back on track. I've done a couple of shorter projects that were 30 days. And the one was 38 days, one was 31 days. It was all improv and then graphic scores. And after this last surgery, which was kind of a monumental thing that was very impactful on my life, I really wanted to do something bigger and something that was like longer and really had some more power like the first two projects did. That being said, I don't have the time, energy, or really motivation to do a full year of daily videos.
That's a lot, yeah.
I figured 100 days was a good length of time. It's over 3 months. And there was a trend for a while of like a 100-day practice challenge, which I have my qualms about. But it's an established model. So I was like, okay, I can take that, put my spin on it. I know that I have to give myself off days. And so I allowed myself 40 improvs, which is still 60 works by living composers. That's a lot of music to learn. But for example, today I had to talk to you, so
Right.
I recorded an improv knowing that I was going to have to do more later things. And there's been times where I've just had 20 minutes to record. And so being able to record an improv that is one take and done is a lot easier.
Yes. Oh, that is some serious, some time management and planning you have to go through in order to, like, sort of get these all done. So really you're using the improvs so that you don't have to learn a piece every day where you might run into a situation where you only have one day to learn something that's not learnable in a day. You're trying to avoid that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, for the most part, I do learn and record these pieces on the same day. That's part of the challenge for me. It's not like in the rules. And there have been a couple pieces that I've done so far that have just been a little too difficult for me to learn in the time frame that I had. And so I worked on them a little bit, put them off for a couple of days, and then put them on a day that was I had a little bit more time. And so it's also a matter of like looking at the piece, being able to figure out how much time is this actually going to take to learn, and then putting it on a day when I have that much time. So you'll notice that some of the more difficult pieces are on weekends. That's obviously by design.
Right.
And I have a feeling that Thanksgiving, since I don't have to work, will have a harder piece on it because I will have time to practice in between cooking and that kind of stuff. So it's also a matter of like assessing the music and how much time is that going to take, and can I even do it in a day? And if not, what kind of time frame do I need to put it in? Or do I need to talk to the composer about excerpting it? Or is there something I can do to make it a little bit easier? Quarter tones I know like down pat. The sixth tones are harder, but they are also a little bit easier to like lip. Whereas like full quarter tones, it's a lot. You really do need the fingering to get it to work right. Whereas sixth tones, especially in a fast passage, the majority of them are so close together that if you aren't playing like a basically a chromatic scale, you can get them close enough that for the speed, it's fine.
Awesome.
It's so easy to play microtonal music on just because it's such a variable instrument and we have so much like tuning range.
So when you're talking about lipping the instrument, you're talking about playing a standard note, like hypothetical example. Let's say you have B with a down arrow indicating B, a sixth tone down. You could play a B, but then in tone with your embouchure a little bit, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like with enough practice and enough comfort level with the tuning system that you're in, it actually becomes a little bit easier to do it that way because the fingerings are nasty.
I assume they're just terrible. Yeah. I like tried it on a saxophone a little bit, and I was just like, I don't know how anyone does this. Trills are really hard.
Ugh, yeah. And it is also easier on an open hole flute, so if you're writing for C flute, there's keys you can vent. There's all these different things. Once you get to the big flutes, then you're stuck with either the fingering or your embouchure.
Oh, really?
So there is a maker of flutes in the Netherlands, Eva Kingma, and she built the Kingma system flute, which is a system of fingerings and a keywork that allows for quarter tone and microtonal fingerings. It's built that way. It's built with venting keys and like this whole extra fingering system. She specializes in the low flutes because that's what really needs them. So she makes alto flutes, bass flutes, contrabass flutes with this microtonal key system. And then there's also a maker in Boston that uses her key system on C flutes to make it a little bit easier. But because C flutes are open hole for the most part, they're a little bit easier to play them anyway. So they're a little bit rarer. But Kingma has really allowed low flute players to have a lot more ability to play microtonal music with a little bit more ease because those fingerings are really, really difficult. I've played a few pieces on alto that I'm just like, oh, this tuning is not right, but I can't figure it out.
The lower you get in the instrument, the more you have to do things like half-holing and fudging. And then like the higher you get in the instrument, the more options you have for like various inflections.
Well, it's because it's based off the harmonic system. Like the first octave of the flute is the bass harmonic. So to adjust those is a lot harder because you have to figure out a way to vent keys that are down and have to be down to make the note work. When you get up into the higher range, you're on a third or fourth partial. It's an altered fingering to begin with. So you could even use a harmonic, and that can sometimes be the right tuning that you need for that particular note at the time. There's so many more options the higher you get in the partials because there's so many different harmonics that you can be on.
Yeah. With your quarter tone fingerings, I know, of course, modern performers, they all know them. Do you practice like quarter tone scales at all? Or is it more when you're thinking about a piece, you practice for that piece and then that's all you've really got to do?
For me personally, I don't play, I guess I do play a good amount of microtonal music at this point. But it's not my sole focus. And so sometimes I haven't played anything with microtones in it for a while, and so I don't remember many of the fingerings, and so then I go back and target, and sometimes I'm doing only microtonal stuff, and so I remember the fingerings really well.
Yeah.
And it's also like if there's only a couple like non-12 EDO pitches in there, I'll just kind of put the fingerings in and cheat, or not even cheat, just give myself a little guide. If it's a completely microtonal work or like in a tuning system that I don't play in very often, then I'll have to practice and just remind myself of what are these fingerings and where do my hands need to go. As it's also a lot of these fingerings like you put fingers down on keys that they don't usually go on.
Right.
So sometimes it's also just muscle memory and like practicing the particular phrase that you're playing, because sometimes it's just that's all you can do. You can't really practice you can't practice the skills because the skills are so individual.
I see what you mean. What's some of the hardest stuff you've had to deal with microtonally? Like, what was a passage where you were trying to do something microtonal and you were like, oh, the fingerings here are brutal? There
was a piece that I played by Brian Pencrott a couple years ago. I guess it was 3 years ago now in Chicago. And it had a lot of microtonal passages, and it was for alto flute. And so there was no leeway in them. It was all these fingerings. And there's a couple, like B quarter flat has this really weird fingering that doesn't work very well.
Low one?
Yeah, I think
it's
quarter flat or quarter sharp. It's one of the Bs. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but it doesn't work. And and there were a lot of whatever this particular note was in this piece, and I was trying to find all these like there's only really one fingering for that. It's not like in the higher range where you have a bunch of options that give you the same tuning, and I ended up just having to figure out a way to get an embouchure change that was stark enough that it would change. Unfortunately, it was also in a passage with B naturals, which so you did have to identify and be able to distinguish the quarter tone from the whole tone, and it took a lot of practice, and I'm not sure I ever really got it correctly. Luckily, it was also an ensemble piece, so I had a little bit more to work with. But for the most part, the solo pieces that I've played have had a pretty good treatment of the microtones.
Yeah, like they've been pretty playable and all that kind of stuff.
I will also admit that I tend to shy away from ones where I can't see it working. For a lot of these calls, I'm just playing whatever pieces come into my inbox, and that I have to do what I'm doing. But when I'm picking my own repertoire, or when I'm doing something that's a little bit more curated, I will be careful of the microtonal pieces that I choose, just because I know how difficult they are and how much time they require. And sometimes I know I don't have the time for it.
Right. Yeah, that can definitely happen. What's the most difficult tuning system you've ever had to work in?
I honestly find just intonation really difficult.
Yeah?
Because my ear just doesn't hear it.
I definitely thought you wouldn't say that.
It's a thing that's not helpful. But yeah, I don't know. I'm honestly tuning is not my forte. I can do microtonal music because I can hear the differences between the pitches, and if I'm like listening, and so equal division of octave tunings are usually fine, because I can figure out where they lie and then we're done. But for some reason, whenever I'm not great at theory, and so I can't think of like where it is in the scale and what do I need to adjust and everything like that, and so then I'm just lost.
Yeah, with just intonation, I feel like you have to like know what else is in the chord and like how that fits in much more than in an equal temperament.
And I think it's less the actual difficulty of the tuning system and more my weaknesses in music. Obviously I had to take theory. I can do musical analysis. I know the basics of it, but I was never good at it, and I was never comfortable with it. I stopped taking theory the second I could. In grad school, I tested out and didn't take any theory, did not go near it. So amusingly, for someone who is as interested in contemporary music as I am not very good on the theoretical side of things, which is interesting because so many composers are also theory majors or minors, or like have a lot of theory basis because of what they do. It just doesn't, except for like matrix analysis and some of the more contemporary theories, I can't do it. I'm not good at it.
So you're more interested in like contemporary theory than like the traditional like common practice stuff.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's where my weaknesses in just intonation come from, is that that performance practice is not something that I'm very good with.
Yeah. Let's say you were presented with an equal temperament that's like, I don't know, something like 17-tone equal temperament or 19-tone equal temperament, where it makes sense to not notate the accidentals with cent deviations. Like, for those fingerings, would you kind of use like a 72-tone sort of grid and like try and get near them, like if somebody gave that to you? Or would you say like, hey, give me fingerings for notes?
I would usually work out the fingerings myself, but because like it's not that hard once I have the fingerings and I know which notes lie where. Right. And in something like a 17 EDO or like one of those, I can figure that out.
Yeah.
It's like just intonation just messes with my head.
Right.
But like it almost seems like, I don't know, I've played a few pieces in it and I always struggle, and I tend to ask people to shy away from it when they're writing for me.
Yeah.
Just for the ease of my own playing, but maybe I should like take it head on and get better at it.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like a reasonable request to not have just intonation, because it's like just intonation promotes this like grouping of people who are very, very interested in it, who all know about it and who all speak that language. But then for everybody who doesn't, it's just like, what are they talking about? Why aren't they talking about intervals in a normal way?
Yeah. Well, it's also really, I find like the microtonal communities all kind of have a little bit of that.
Oh, yeah.
Like they're having kind of come into the community in a very strange way as a performer and as solely a performer, and again, not having a ton of theory behind it and just kind of going, oh yeah, I can play this stuff, so let's figure it out. It's very interesting, like talking to people who work mostly in microtonal music, because there are so many factions and different ideas behind it. And like, I've seen you on Facebook have conversations with people, and I'm like, I kind of know what's happening right now. I do understand what the basis of this conversation is, but the details of it are completely lost on me.
I can get crazy. Yeah.
So yeah, it's been really fun kind of coming in and out of the microtonal world. And yeah, that's the thing, is I like it. It's a challenge. It's something I can play the extended stuff. I can play all of the Ferneyhough, like Skirino mess. So this is a new territory to explore that doesn't necessarily fit with the way that I've learned how to play, and so it's really nice to have the challenge.
Oh yeah. And I think your input is also very valuable as a performer, because there tends to be a trend of many microtonalists either writing for themselves or not really going through the music theory ropes before they get to it. So then they kind of don't understand like what the needs of the modern performer are. Have you ever had to play something microtonal that used like the non-5-line staff, like a different weird staff that somebody made just for microtonality? Because microtonalists talk about that and it almost never is used, but I'd love to, prove that notion wrong.
I've never seen it. That being said, maybe I have and just didn't know it at the time.
Hey, maybe.
Because there's been some score, like especially when I was in grad school, I was playing a lot of contemporary music that I just didn't really understand, because I was the only flutist who was comfortable trying. Considering how like detailed microtonal composers are about their score, I can't imagine that I would have encountered it without knowing. That being said, there's been some stuff that I've played, especially in 365, that who knows what they were asking me to do, mainly because the front matter was in a language I don't understand.
Nice.
So I did what I could. But for the most part now, I try to avoid doing that, because I don't think it's respectful to the composers as well. It's not really fair to not play their piece properly just because I don't speak the language they speak. I have had some composers who said the technique was wrong, which was fun. I guess technically that was a microtonal. It was kind of a spectral piece, I guess, that I'm thinking of. But that it had nothing to do with the pitches and everything to do with the way I was creating them. I mean, if I'm playing something and like the microtone is completely off, I've had some people be like, hey, that's not in the right tuning. But that's totally fair. I find that fair game, as long if I was like that far off that you could hear it was completely in the wrong tuning system. But if it's close, especially in rehearsal, I've never had anyone tell me like, no, that's the wrong, that's however many cents sharp.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. I mean, I've also been lucky. I work mostly with people who know me and respect my time and skill, and I respect them as composers. So I've been very lucky with the collaborations that I have. That being said, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. You never know what you're gonna get, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're so passionate about new music. That's very exciting. I think you talked about that on the on the Classical Nerd interview.
Wow, that's an old one.
Yeah, I tried to, but I'm trying to like not just ask the exact same questions that he did.
No,
So-
you're doing a good job so far. So
There we go. Okay, good.
Adam Kenna is also doing a podcast that I was on a couple weeks ago. Also different questions. It's called Making Noise.
Ooh, I haven't heard of that. I'm gonna
Yeah.
check that out.
He's done like 6 or 7 episodes now.
Oh, nice. So how did you first become involved with Un12?
Ralph Lewis. As many people are involved with things because of Ralph. I've known Ralph since 2016. We were at Fresh Ink, which is Fifth House Ensemble's summer music festival.
Ooh.
In 2016, and we're kind of the most avant-garde composer performers there, and became friends kind of because of that, because we were talking about the avant-garde, and a lot of the composers for some reason that year were more like contemporary classical and less kind of the experimental stuff, and that's not a problem, obviously. It was just being someone who had just come out of like learning Cassandra's Dream Song. I was not expecting as few composers who really focused on avant-garde performance. And so Ralph and I became friends, and he was in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and which is only a couple hours from Chicago. So we started collaborating. We've done a few concerts in Chicago, and in 2018, Un12 was starting a diverse call for microtonal composers and asked me to play on the call, along with my former roommate, Emily Mihai, who's a clarinetist. And he, through talking to me, was like, hey, like, we would also be interested in working with you on the board. Like, would you be open to that? And at the time I had microtonal experience, but not anything. I kind of knew what I was talking about when I was talking about stuff. But a lot of the vernacular was pretty foreign to me, and like was starting to learn that. And so they brought me on to the board, and I suddenly learned what like 17 EDO was very quickly.
Yeah.
And so then we did a couple concerts in 2018 with pieces from that call. And then also I was the judge for the composition contest that year, or one of the judges. And so, yeah, that's kind of, it was basically Ralph is the long and the short of it.
I also met him and got more into microtonality because I think I was checking out colleges like after high school, and I went to Urbana-Champaign and he was there, and he told me about Jacob Barton for the first time.
I have an Utterbot somewhere in this apartment.
Oh, me too. I see you've been influenced by him as well.
Well, actually, that was Ralph is the one who made it for me. Also at Fresh Ink, I'm a flutist. If you give me a glass bottle, I have a tendency to play it.
Yeah.
And Ralph, at one hangout or another, heard me playing glass bottles and was like, actually, I have an instrument for you.
Yeah.
And made me an Utterbot, and I've never really done much with it. I've kind of played around with it, but yeah, it's a really fun instrument. I wish I should do more with it, but I have a few others that I'm a little more focused on, for better or for worse.
I'm sure someone who plays flute professionally, you know, like I can't play the flute. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you breathe that well.
Practice. 19 years of playing it. Amusingly enough, my first flute lesson ever was scheduled for September 11th, 2001.
Uh-oh.
So, needless to say, it did not happen. But basically, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland Orchestra is king there. And my parents were very interested in classical music and would take me to the educational concerts. And they always have like some activity for the kids in the intermission or beforehand. And like there's usually an instrument petting zoo during one of the concerts. And so I was like 4 or 5 and was trying all the instruments. And apparently the only two I could get sounds out of were flute and French horn. And me being a 5-year-old girl did not want to play French horn, apparently. And so I decided I really, really wanted to play flute. And I was in the prep division at Cleveland Institute of Music, and they have prep in all instruments. And so I was in piano, and my parents asked, like, how would we start flute? And they said, you cannot start until she's in 4th grade. They would not start students younger than that because of lung development. And so they're like, continue with piano. In 4th grade, you'll have your trial lesson with this teacher, and then we can start you. And so when September 25th or whatever it was, or whenever I did actually have my lesson, I was accepted by this very, very elderly Hungarian man who taught prep division at the Cleveland Institute. And I ended up being one of his last students because he retired when I was in high school. So I was one of the few that he got into high school. And then I continued, and I just never really wanted to do anything else. So it just happened that way.
It's such a driving force for you that you're willing to, do all these amazing things to, like put out videos on the YouTube channel about techniques as well as these various Days of X kind of challenges.
I will say that if you knew me 10 years ago, it would not be. You wouldn't expect me to be as into contemporary music and as focused on it as I am now. I went into undergrad and even my master's thinking I was going to be an orchestral player and wanting to be an orchestral player. I loved new music. I played new music or worked with composers, but it was never really the thing that I thought I could do or wanted to do. And there was a semester at Indiana where I didn't make an orchestra. I was playing in band and I was kind of miserable as it just wasn't a very fun experience. It was kind of not a great semester. I was in grad school and I wanted to be in orchestras because that's what you're supposed to be doing. Right. And so I was like, okay, well, there's like 50 composers at the school and seemingly no one plays for these composers. And I do really love this. So, hey, let's try this. Let's play from more composers and let's do more composer collaborations because that'll get me on stage and playing more. And I realized I didn't miss orchestra. I actually was happier and less stressed and really enjoying what I was doing. And so I go to my teacher and she goes, you could just do this. Like you do know that this is a viable career option. And to be honest, I would recommend you to do it because you are so much more passionate about contemporary music than you are anything else that we're learning. And so she conveniently was very on board to kind of change directions and help me figure out a contemporary career. And I had been making videos since I'm on Tumblr since 2012 and on YouTube since 2015.
Yeah.
So when I kind of switched from like music major orchestra stuff on the YouTube channel to contemporary stuff, it felt more natural and it felt comfortable. And I realized mainly because of my experience in Indiana where no one knew how to do any of this stuff through no fault of their own, no one had ever taught them. That there was a really big gap in flute education, especially considering that the more standard that these techniques become, the harder it is to get into a music career without knowing them. And unfortunately, we all kind of know the old guard of music schools are pretty set in their ways. So there's really no way that these people are necessarily going to learn these techniques unless they get really lucky and study with a Molly Barth or a Claire Chase, or like there's a ton of contemporary specialists who are incredible. Connor Nelson, to name a few. But you weren't always that lucky to get an incredible teacher who has a great knowledge of contemporary music. And a lot of this stuff is really hard to learn on your own. When I was learning Cassandra's Dream Song, I didn't do it until I knew I had a teacher who was willing to teach me it, because that piece is so daunting, and it's not even the most daunting of his work. And I just didn't know where to start. But that experience let me know where to start, like gave me experience of like learning something like that where you don't know how to practice it, you don't know where to break it down. And so it made me realize that I could be that resource, especially in a modern era where we all use the internet for reference. It's helping my community, also creating a career for myself that isn't necessarily tied to where I live. Which at the time was really helpful because I was not getting gigs in Chicago whatsoever. And so I needed to do something that was musically fulfilling.
Yeah.
And then also came up with these challenge projects that were also fulfilling for me as a musician and challenging for me as a musician, while also giving back to composers and trying to create more symbiotic relationships and more resources.
So it sounds like working with contemporary music definitely has a lot of challenges. Like, what do you think some more of those challenges are?
I mean, there's so many different languages. Like, even as we talked about in microtonal music, there's so many different tuning systems and ways of notating and language barriers, essentially. And that's true with contemporary music that doesn't involve microtones. There's a ton of different notations for contemporary techniques. There's a ton of different like musical styles that you really do have to kind of understand what, like, if you don't know what spectral music is, how are you supposed to play spectral music? There is a learning curve there. And there's a learning curve of like, here are a bunch of symbols on a page, and like, where do you go to figure out what those symbols mean? Even the simple things of like, you just go to the front of the piece and like, look at the key. But then how do you translate that when you've been learning traditional notes your whole life? Like, how do you relearn how to read music when you're 25, 26 or younger even? There's so many different variables because everyone's working in their own language, which is one of the wonderful things as well. But in terms of access, and especially from a performer's perspective, from a performer that is a little more wary, getting thrown a score that looks like gibberish to them is very scary and can turn them off, even if that score itself is actually like just wind tones and you don't really need to play the notated pitches exactly, but you have to know that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think it would be really scary if you're a performer in a situation where you're given something and then you don't know what's going on. Like, I think maybe there are some performers who fear microtonality and or similar disciplines because of that. Like, they don't want to be made the fool because they don't know about X technique, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, the reality is, for the most part, like, I've worked with hundreds of composers over the last few years, and none of them have been nasty about me not knowing something. Like,
right.
The example I use the most is like Sciarino's flute techniques are made up. Like, he made them up. Like, it's just, they're gibberish if you don't know they're from Sciarino.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is not a well-known thing with composers. And so sometimes I get this thing that I can probably figure out as a Sciarino technique because it just makes no sense to me, and like, I can't find any reference to it anywhere. And I email the composer and I'm like, hey, what is this? And they always send me some Sciarino score, usually in Italian. And I have to figure it out. And then I kind of send a note back like, hey, just so you know, this isn't standard. Please explain it better in your score. Here's what I would tell you. But unfortunately, there aren't as many performers like me who will gave that information back, they'll take the information from the composer, play the piece, complain about it, and then never think about it again. And so the cycle continues. In my career, trying to break that cycle and make it a little bit easier for composers and performers to interact with each other, and also for performers to see a piece and know exactly what's happening, even if they don't necessarily know how to do it yet. What's on the page is clear, and they can figure out how to do it, because the how is easier than the reading part of it.
Well, I think that kind of dialogue is super helpful for composers. Even composers who have worked with a lot of different instruments before sometimes might not know how to notate things the best way for a performer.
Right. And it is very personal. There's scores that were written for me that other players have seen, and they're like, oh, why did they write it like that? I hate that. And I'm like, oh, I asked them to, so don't give the problem. Like, it's not the composer's problem.
Right.
I think that is part of the problem with the point we're at in contemporary music, is that there's no standards.
Right.
And you can make up notation for things that other people have different notation for. And no one can fault you for it, because what are you supposed to do? There is no notation for it. And it's not like the French language, where there's this group of people who decide what words are no longer words once a year.
Yeah.
So we don't have a council of flute players who decide this is how you do all of these things. So unfortunately, there's a lot of variables. And all we can do is at least be clear in what we're writing and what we're playing. So yeah, one of my other I have a lot of notation nitpicks that are my own thing, but I am always very clear about, like, here is what my notation should be. If you're writing for me, like, here are the symbols that I understand how to read. Please use them.
I was very, very happy to see that in the contemporary techniques video, because then I used those notations because I was writing for you, and there weren't any questions about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there should there be a council of flute players who decides what those notations are?
There's a part of me that wants to say yes. There's a part of me that says absolutely not. The yes side is because it would be so helpful, and then we could actually give composers resources that are completely coherent and universal. And you don't have the problem where, like, Robert Dick's book has one thing, and the book that's in French that I can't remember the name of has one thing, and the book that's in German that I also can't remember the name of has one thing. Like, there's all these different languages and different resources that have completely different things. So that would be really nice. But also, I don't know if we could come to a conclusion. Having had the experience of, like, I prefer singing and playing in one staff with no ossia. That's how I read it. I read, like, based on the flute pitches, how I get my voice interval. I don't want them separated. I know people who hate it, who want it on a separate line almost exclusively. So how do you decide that's complete preference. So in that point, I would just say, whoever premiered the piece gets to pick what it's notated in. Like,
yeah.
There are certain techniques, like the percussive sounds. I think we could pick one notation for them. That is really easy, and I think we should just do that. But I can respect that other people read music differently than I do. So who am I to tell them that they have to read it the way I do? And who is this group of random 10, however many people, to decide that, like, the whole world has to play flute this way? So
right.
I wish there was a little bit more codification, and I wish the people who wrote resources could, like, decide some stuff together. Even just the names of the techniques would be nice, because sometimes you see tongue pizzicato, sometimes you see slap tongue, sometimes you see, like, percussive sound.
Oh no!
And they usually all mean the same thing.
Oh yeah, that has got to be dreadfully confusing. Definitely, seems like a side effect of how, you mentioned contemporary music has no standards. So then people sort of independently come to different conclusions, and it might be difficult for them to track down the technique that they are in fact using if they don't put enough thought into it. It reminds me of Gardner Reed's microtonal book about 20th century microtonal notation, where he goes through and lists all these various different ways that people notated things like quarter tones and stuff like that. And people came up with their own unique versions and solutions that all really meant similar things or close to the same thing.
Yeah.
Definitely a hallmark of contemporary practice for sure.
Yeah, the only thing that I can think of that has like one standard is Skirino, because he made them up himself and he's the first person to do it, and we have modern references for it. Whereas like a lot of these other techniques, I don't know where they came from. Like slap tongue clearly came from saxophone playing. There's no way it didn't. Like key clicks are old enough, and they like we can track them back far enough that one has a standard notation. But everything else, like who knows who did it the first time, and who knows whose notation is the correct one. With Skirino's techniques, we just know because he made them up with this flutist, a friend of his, and he put them in his music, and we have a reference for that. But everything else there's so many different trails and tracks that how are you supposed to know?
Wow, how intriguing that many of those are a mystery.
I mean, I'm sure someone who has researched it more can give you more of a history. I don't necessarily care where they came from, as long as I'm like keeping up with their developments now. But obviously, like you have pieces from almost 50 years ago now that have these techniques in them with a relatively standard notation across the board. Like if you look at Takemitsu versus Ferneyhough, they're kind of the same, like notation wise. So someone was talking.
Yeah.
But at some point, some of these techniques kind of went off the deep end. And people started doing other things with them. And I don't know where that split was, and I don't know when that split was, and I don't know if it was a conscious choice to be different because they don't want to be associated with the new complexity movement or whatever else movement they didn't want to be associated with. Because there are also like, I love new complexity. I have a thing for it. I learned notation especially from new complexity pieces, and I learned a very old fingering chart for flute that I use. Like I use these 50-year-old references because that's what I studied, and that's what I got used to. But there are people who are really against new complexity. So did they choose to use different notation because they didn't want people to see their pieces as new complexity but still wanted to use the sounds? I don't know. Like new complexity scores are such an identifiable thing that's what makes me think about it. But right. They're like counterculture musical references are like part of music history. You don't have minimalists without what came before it, and you don't have serialists without what came before that. So like I get it, and like chance music came out of like determinate music. Like it makes sense. So I could also see someone being like, none of this new complexity BS. I want to use these sounds, but I don't want it to be scary on the page, and I don't want this like overcomplicated thing. So I'm going to use different symbols that are like nicer and rounder and cleaner, or whatever it is.
what I think is that lots of people should be doing those like daily events like you do, but maybe with other instruments or with other like microtonal things. I think it would be perfectly paired with some microtonal instruments, because it's like lots of people grab a microtonal guitar and then they realize they're not using it enough. And so like, what if they did something like, microtonal guitar every day? It's like day one is like a 19-tone cover of Yesterday by the Beatles or something, Yeah. Or like you just go through a bunch of stuff,
Well, that's the thing. Like I gave a talk last month at a Splice Festival about these projects and like what you can do with them. And it doesn't just have to be like, here's this project and here's all this music and now I'm done. Like you can use them, exactly what you were saying, to explore a new instrument, to explore a new style, to do something that can like help your musical education as well as being interesting for the viewer. So I think they are a really viable, interesting way to, one, create on the internet, to create, unfortunately, in this COVID sphere. Though I do hope that I'm going to continue post COVID when we can leave our houses and see people and play concerts. But yeah, I think they're really, really helpful things that are very interesting interesting for the performer as well. And honestly, sometimes it's 100 videos in a row is a lot to watch.
It's a lot, yeah.
Like I would never expect everyone who is watching my videos to watch every single one of them.
Working on it.
Yeah, again, like if people watch half, I'm like, oh, cool, awesome, like you did a great job there. There were I produced a lot of content, but it's also a process of growing as a musician. I will say I will never do a 365 daily video project again, but I would never take it back. Like that changed my life. It changed how I think about music. It changed how I think about my career, and I will always appreciate that project. So I can say that did that for me. There's no reason that it wouldn't for other people, and also open a world of possibilities of instruments and musical styles and whatever it is.
What are some of the more unusual compositions you've received, or what's something that sticks out in your mind as, oh, I'll never see something like that composition again? What on earth was that?
I mean, I guess there's a couple graphic scores that were very, very distinctive. They were mostly text scores, which, I mean, of it, like the minute you add text into the mix, things get strange. There were a couple graphic scores that that really stick out to me as like, oh yeah, that one was really interesting, and it wasn't like what you think of a graphic score necessarily, where you kind of just have pictures on a page or you have symbols on a page. It really used the graphic element and a really interesting manipulation of text and graphics. So those two were really, those stick out in my mind. One was by Ben Zucker and the other one was by Justin Hauser. And they were in the 31 Days of Graphic Scores project. And then there's a piece that I learned in 365 by a Colombian composer, Luis Miguel Delgado Grande. There we go. Luis, he wrote this piece called Soma, and it was like very, very extended. It's the first time I ever saw singing with multiphonics. It was the first time I'd really seen someone use almost entirely extended notes and do it in such a beautiful, like, trance-like way. And that piece, I've played it a bunch of times, and it's one of the ones that I just like really, really treasure. So I don't think it's necessarily that I won't see anything like that score again, but I won't have that feeling ever again. So that one definitely stands out. I don't know. I guess I'm a little jaded having seen like 500 scores in the last 3 years. There's not a lot you can throw at me that I'm like, oh, I don't know what that is.
Right.
but I think like the musical quality and like the way that it makes me feel when I'm playing it, that's really what stands out to me now. Because you don't always know. I can tell how hard it's going to be or how much time it's going to take me, but I don't know exactly what it's going to sound like or how it's going to sit in my fingers or in my playing style until I start working on it. And then there's some things that just click right in, and I'm like, oh, I could play this forever. And there's some things that I do struggle with. And it's always kind of nice to see those too, of like, okay, I have some weak points still. Good. We're still learning. We're still growing. But yeah, I really enjoyed that one. And I will I won't say anything about this current project because there's still 59 more days left to go.
There we go. 59 more days left. How do you feel about pieces that require like multi-tracking? I saw with the Christopher Bailey piece that you had like the big giant flute, and then you had a bunch of other ones around. Like if someone wrote like 50 flute parts for you and had you put 50 videos together, like I assume you wouldn't do that, man. But like,
I hate editing.
Oh my gosh, it's the worst, isn't it?
I've gotten really good at it. I can probably like that piece took a long time because I had to re-render it over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah.
Because I use iMovie because I don't feel like buying software. Considering the number of multi-track pieces that I have in my future, I need to bite the bullet and not use iMovie.
Yeah, iMovie is good for like quick and dirty.
Oh,
like yeah. I always use iMovie for like the Now and Zen like episode background. I just stretch it to the right size and export it, and it's super easy. It's like not as complicated.
But yeah, I don't enjoy editing. Especially when I'm editing myself, I don't like watching myself. It's not fun. So I honestly have a better time doing it for other people. But yeah, the issue that I have with multi-track is just it takes forever. And if one track is off, you're completely done.
Right.
Actually, for Chris's piece, the solo track, I got off a measure the first time I did it, and that piece is really hard.
Oh no!
So like the accompaniment is really easy because it's all long held notes. You just have to make sure you're playing long enough and like resting long enough. But the solo line is very, very difficult. And I got off a measure somehow. I like didn't hold something long enough and was 10 seconds short. And I went to render it and was like, nope, I have to do this again. So I had to like pull out all of my recording equipment again because I thought I was done and redo it and make sure that it was long enough.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That is so much work. The pitfalls of editing.
Oh yeah. And I mean, like it's almost impossible without a click track. Luckily, that particular piece was all one tempo, so I literally just had a metronome going in my ear, rather than build a like metered click track because that didn't seem like a lot of time I wanted to spend. But I've done some like duets with myself where I needed a metered click track because it changed tempo and it changed meter in a way that I couldn't just have a like straight metronome click. And those were a lot harder. I've also learned like give yourself an audible like lineup point in everything so that you're not like trying to line things up based on sound files.
Right.
I've learned a lot of tricks to get it to work better, but I probably would draw the line at like 10 of myself at least.
It's a pretty good line.
Yeah. The people who are editing these like virtual orchestra pieces, I give them so much credit.
It's insane, really. People really undersell like how much time that takes. It just takes so long. And then it's like you've got all these videos and they just like ruin your computer storage. Every time I do a virtual project, I just take it all and put it on the terabyte.
Yep.
So that my computer exactly theoretically has nothing. Yeah.
Yep. I have the same terabyte.
Yes. Awesome. thank you so much for being on the show. By the way, really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess since we've got so much stuff, is there anything? Well, what do you want to like promote? I assume you want to promote the 100 Days of Composers.
Yeah, definitely that. I think like that's really the only project I have going right now because I had jaw surgery 3 months ago, so I give myself a bit of a break there. Yeah, definitely 100 Days, and I guess my YouTube channel in general.
Yeah.
Like the whole point is to build resources for composers, so they have to be used.
Yes. Of course. This has been Robin Meiksins on Now and Zen. Thanks so much for being on, Robin. We appreciate having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hello, listeners. I want to thank all of you for listening to the show and offering your thoughts. User input really helps make this show a whole lot better. And I'm extremely proud of every single episode that's been put out. They're all unique and special in different ways, and they showcase a breathtaking variety of Zen harmonic and microtonal music. Our schedule for 2020 has changed a little bit again. Our November bonus episode now features Sevish, Zotla, Benyamind, and myself all talking about new albums coming out in 2020. Sevish is premiering his on YouTube December 26th, and Zotla's album has already come out on Bandcamp. Be sure to check these out in the description. Mine should be coming out on Bandcamp too. What a great landslide of new stuff. In December, our episode on the 12th will feature D. Silton, our episode on the 31st will feature Method's Body, and our bonus episode will feature Subrag Singh. Patreon updates. Recently, we crossed the 40 patron mark, so I have been hard at work creating a keyboard arrangement of Easley Blackwood's 16-note microtonal etude. We need to get 60 patrons to continue Now and Zen by December 1st. That's a pretty tough deadline right now, since at the time I'm putting this out, it's November 27th, and so there are only 4 days left to amass 20 more patrons. Normally, the growth is slower than that, though unpredictable, so I'm thinking we might not make it. During the hiatus, I will continue to provide bonus content monthly on the Now and Zen account, featuring workflow footage about projects, collaborations, and groundbreaking microtonal ideas. Lots of these will feature reinterpretations of cover songs, music theory and educational material, and composition tidbits. I generally provide much more than one piece of content per month even now, so with lots of time freed up from Now and Zen, I'll be getting to work on several creative projects that I've wanted to undertake for years. My Patreon account is the only place that you can currently find microtonal keyboard fingering charts, previews to Zen harmonic multi-instrumental cover songs, and many other resources and community ideas. If the Patreon account gets past 60 patrons, I'll come back to creating Now and Zen podcast episodes. Next time, it might even be fun to try more formats, like shorter episodes that are more frequent, or theory workshops, jams, etc. Keep on making microtonal music, everyone. A big special thanks to our Zen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Zen Harmonic gods. Sheldon Bird, Tristan Nunez, Barry Lemon, Ari Cello, Rob Astor, Adam Freese, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Sicarella, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joe Weigel, Tina Harmon Carto, and the Brass Whisperer. Catch you next time on Now and Zen.